thanks for inviting me to come out to speak to the group.
Thanks for coming.
As Howard mentioned, I corresponded with Ray Brooks when I was a kid, when I was in high school. And you're going to see the genesis of this presentation really started when I was in high school. I've been working on this thing essentially my entire adult life. And I wanted to give you that a little bit. The other thing I wanted to point out is the presentation will take about 45 minutes or so. I know there's about a 45-minute bladder limit. Right? So I'll try to get through this as quick as possible. I'm going to go through some stuff in the beginning here that may be information you already have, so I apologize in advance, but I wanted to give you some background on aviation in World War I, because not many people are familiar with that. So let's get rolling here. So as you know, World War I was the first war that the airplanes were used in. So we're going to give you a brief primer on Great War aviation. Remember the faces of these guys, they're going to show up a little later in the presentation, right at the end. So keep an eye on those guys. And the airplane. Everybody here is an aviation interested person, so I may be giving you more information than you need, but just talk about this real quickly. It's a new technology. As I said, World War I's first war, organized war, where we've used airplanes. The airplanes are made out of wood and canvas primarily. Some aircraft were metal, but not many. No heat, so you're flying at winter altitudes of 20,000 feet, 18,000 feet without benefit of heat. No supplemental oxygen for those guys, and aviation aerospace medicine was not well understood at the time, so there was a lot of experimentation going on there. Guys were coming down with headaches virtually every time they went over 18,000 feet, came down in a big hurry, nobody understood why yet. No parachutes on the Allied side. The Germans had them late in the war, but the Allies never had them. Balloon observers had them, but not pilots. Airplanes obviously highly flammable, and all pilots here know that's the worst thing that can happen to you when you're in an airplane is it catches fire. But in that time, the airplane is still evolving, and it's versatile, and it's employed in numerous roles: fighter roles, observation, bombing, etc. So 1914, just a little quick comparison. These are the airplanes that were being used on the French side of the line, and it was similar on the Germans and the Brits at the time. The Blériot 11 in 1909 airplane that flew the English Channel. First time 21 miles. It was a big deal in 1909 to fly 21 miles in an airplane, especially across the Channel. And a Farman, you see the difference between a tractor airplane and a pusher airplane. Engines in the back, very bad aerodynamic design, but gave a great field of view for the gunner or the observer, camera operator. Pilots at the time, again, everything is developing. You have to understand that everything is developing in World War I. The role of the airplane, the equipment that's being used, the airplanes themselves, the pilot's gear looks like they're going on Arctic expeditions here, and they're flying at 18,000 feet in the wintertime, freezing their rear ends off. So they're doing everything they can to stay warm. They're putting whale grease on their face, trying to cover up every exposed part of your body so you don't get frostbitten while you're flying. And what were they used for? Initially, airplanes are used for aerial observation. So you have a German Taube, this kind of bird-looking airplane, and a British BE-2 with a camera attached, sort of replacement for the cavalry. And what are they photographing? Enemy back positions, aerodromes, fuel dumps, gun emplacements, the trench lines along the Western Front. This is kind of what it looked like all up and down the Western Front. It just looks like the face of the moon. It's described by the pilots as being the face of the moon many times. You have the Balloon Corps, mentioned them parenthetically since we have a uniform up here from the Balloon Corps guys. These guys are hanging in a basket, doing the same thing, artillery ranging from these baskets and watching troop movements, and hydrogen-filled balloons. Okay. So everybody know that any World War I, other than interested in this talk today, anybody know a lot about World War I? No? Today is the 100th anniversary of the death of Frank Luke. Everybody know that name? Frank Luke?
Luke Air Force Base. Luke Air Force Base.
Yeah, Luke Air Force Base, right, exactly. Frank Luke was number 2 ace, U.S. Air Service, 18 victories, shot down 15 balloons, had 18 victories in 18 days, and was killed on the 29th of September, 1918.
And November 11th will be the end of the war.
Yeah, the 100th anniversary. That's one of the reasons that I'm doubled up on the talks this year, because of the 100th anniversary of the war. As you know, it started in 1914 and ended on the 11th of November, 100 years ago this year. The first fighter airplanes is a German 9-decker and a French Morane. Everybody know the difference between heaven and hell? It's a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it. Okay, in heaven, the Germans are the engineers, and the British are the police, and the French are the cooks. And in hell, the Germans are the police, and the British are the cooks, and the French are the engineers. And I mention that here because the German solution to the forward firing machine gun, which was a huge innovation, was a synchronizer device that stopped the gun from firing as the propeller blade got up in the line of fire here. The French solution can be seen here. It's a metal wedge on the back of the propeller. And it just deflected the 6% or so of bullets off. Now, we all laugh at that, but the French actually produced some of the best fighter airplanes of the war. So we make fun of them for that, but they got their act together later. By 1918, you're looking at airplanes like this, the SE-5, 220 horsepower airplane, 185 horsepower Fokker D7, very good airplanes, could fly at 20,000 feet easily.
Were those rotary, or were those piston driven?
These guys, or the...
The ones we were showing, whether the engine itself rotated?
This one, yeah. So both of these are rotary engines.
The engine itself rotated?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The difference between a radial engine and a rotary engine. Radial is a stationary engine, and the rotary engine rotates with the airplane, with the propeller. Not with the airplane, with the propeller. So the Fokker D7, very good airplane. In fact, it was so good that the Allies mentioned them in the Treaty of Versailles, that the Germans had to turn over all aircraft, including especially those of the Fokker D7 type. So there was a lot of these airplanes turned over to the Allies after the war, at least the ones that the Germans didn't deliberately crash when they were trying to turn them over. They were wiping landing gears off in the pancake landing and trying to destroy them before the Allies got their hands on them. But really a great airplane, the best fighter of the war. So at the beginning of the war, you saw that kind of pulpit job. They're dropping bombs out of there, 25-pound bombs, 20-pound bombs, dropping them by hand. By the end of the war, the Germans had developed this thing. This is a Zeppelin Stocking R6. It's a 4-engined airplane. It's got a crew of 8. It's heated cabins. It's got a cockpit in here, or a little compartment for the mechanics to tend both of those engines in flight. So he's in there greasing the rockers and squirting oil and stuff during flight. Well, he's nice and cozy because it's nice and warm in there with 2 engines. But they were flying these things at night over the English Channel. You know, and navigation at the time, they've got no electronic navigation. It's kind of England's that way, let's go. And that was what they were flying. So you go from that very kind of rudimentary airplane to this thing. The British also had a bomber like that. It's kind of this is for storage purposes, obviously, not a swing wing design, but so it's a bit better than hangars. But they're carrying ordnance like this by the end of the war, 1,650-pound bombs. So the development from that first 20-pound bomb to this later ordnance package is just remarkable to me. And it all happened in 4 years. It's a 4-year span we're looking at here. Okay, as I said, the role of the aircraft is developing. So we know fighters, and we know interceptors, and we know observation aircraft, and we know long-range reconnaissance, and we know bombers and all that stuff. But all of those roles are being developed during World War I. The Germans have developed the ground attack role, so aircraft that were specifically designed for those purposes were developed. This is a Junkers J1, one of the first all-metal airplanes. It has an armored cockpit for both occupants and the engine, so you've got a big bathtub in here that's armored. And it's super slow, like 75-mile-an-hour top speed, but its whole sole purpose was to fly over the trenches and fire into the trench, all ground interdiction kind of missions. But again, this was developed in 1916, by the way, this airplane. So let's go real quick, comparison between the beginning and the end. So 1914, you're topping out about 55 miles an hour, 5,000 feet, fly for about an hour and a half. During the daytime, and your armament was rifles and handguns and flechettes, you know, the sort of little metal arrows that they used to drop out of airplanes on the troops. But by 1918, you got airplanes that were routinely flying at 130 miles an hour, flying over 20,000 feet, carrying more than a ton of ordnance. 5-hour duration for some of the larger airplanes. We had patrol boats, coastal patrol flying boats, that could fly for 7 hours. So day and nighttime, they're flying with 30 caliber machine guns, multiple guns, and occasionally 37mm cannons in these airplanes. So, yes, sir.
In World War I, they wore face oxygen masks at 21,000?
No. The Germans had supplemental oxygen. You've ever seen the photographs of them? It's a guy with a tube. And he's literally sucking on a tube out of an oxygen canister, liquid oxygen canister. But again, since this is all developing, nobody knows about flight physiology. This is all new stuff to them. So they're working on on this. They're trying to understand why pilots behave the way they do at altitude, why they can only go for so long, why 12,500 feet hasn't been figured out yet, and supplemental oxygen above that point. So it's, like I said, it's a really, you're going to see a lot of things where you're saying to yourself, why the hell did he do that? Well, at the time, they didn't know any better. This stuff was still developing. Okay, so most people's introduction to World War I looks like this. Okay, so Snoopy and his famous doghouse Sopwith Camel. And most people's introduction to the German side is this. The red Fokker triplane and the hot rod, the Red Baron. But the reality of it is that this is what a Sopwith Camel looked like. This is Percy Cunnius from Highland Park, New Jersey. By the way, most of these guys I'm going to show you today are from New Jersey. And his Sopwith Camel, a rotary-powered fighter. And the real Red Baron was actually this guy, 26-year-old Manfred von Richthofen, killed in April of 1918. So these are real guys we're talking about, not some cartoon thing. They look at Snoopy and you watch the cartoons, and this is how he gets shot down. But we all know that the results of a shoot down look a lot different than that. This is what these airplanes look like after they hit the ground. They're not metal airplanes. Like I said, they're all wood and fabric. So when they hit the ground, collision with Mother Earth is not good for them. And some of them were no more than that once they hit the ground. The next photograph, everybody done eating? Good. Yeah. This is an American pilot whose name you may know, Quentin Roosevelt. He's the fourth, Quentin Roosevelt. He's the fourth son of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a fighter pilot in World War I, was shot down behind German lines. Germans made a postcard to this, ultimately, as propaganda. And when the German populace started to look at it, they said, well, this is, they understood who Teddy Roosevelt was because he had been popular with the Germans before the war. And they started looking, and Teddy had 4 sons in the service, all had been wounded or injured. And this, of course, poor Quentin got killed. The Kaiser's sons were all in the Black Forest shooting wild boar for the whole war. So the propaganda value of this was not very good back at home. Yeah, but we're here to talk about New Jersey, guys. Here's some of our home state flyers. Smattering of photographs. I'll give you a little background on the project that brought all this stuff to you today. I've been doing this, like I said, since I was 16 years old. I've had an interest in aviation my entire life. I started flying when I was 16. I got my pilot's license when I was 18. And World War I somehow just fascinated me. I've been working on this project since 1976. When I was 16, first year of high school. I had 35 names of New Jersey pilots to start with. I've got 763 biographies written to date. This covers probably 95% of all the guys. There's, and I'll tell you why some of them, I'm never going to find some of them, it's just never going to happen because they served with the British or the French, and there's no consolidated list of those guys with their hometowns attached to it. So I've used original diaries, letters home, logbook, personal photographs, you name it. Lots of hours in the library when I was a kid. I should have been out chasing girls, and I was in there looking at photographs of guys from 100 years ago. I'm still working on it. It's only been 42 years at this point. And at the time, there was no internet. So everything, if I wanted to find anything, I had to go to the library and spend hours looking for it. Stuff I can find now literally in seconds used to take me hours and hours of time. But I do have a publisher for all this. 763 biographies waiting for people to see. Okay, New Jersey's Aviators joined French and British squadrons starting in 1915, 2 years before the U.S. entered the war. So if you know the story about the Eagle Squadron guys in World War II, it was the same kind of idea. American citizens who had sometimes had familial ties to France or Britain thought it was their duty to go over and help protect those countries that their parents came from. So they would enlist in these services as what are called direct entry volunteers. They would literally be French soldiers or British soldiers for the duration of the war. A lot of them, as you probably know, had comfortable situations here. They were in college. They had, most of them were well-off, well-educated guys. They didn't have to go, but they thought it was their duty, so they went. And a lot of them even did this. They exaggerated portions of their applications to qualify. Some were underage. Some were Americans, obviously, with no ties back to France or Britain. But France and Britain didn't really care. If you said, I was born in Toronto, Canada, they believed you. They didn't need any documentation. They wanted pilots. You were willing. Okay, let's go. So, and there's a lot of reasons that they did it, as I pointed out, from patriotism to, adventure to avoiding legal encumbrances. Back in the States, it seemed like a particularly good time to get out of New Jersey, so they went went over to France. This chart was generated a couple of years ago. Where are they from? You look at the distribution. of pilots here, and obviously it's from most of the population centers. As you start getting up in this corner of the state, this is broken down by county, and that's just the numbers that I was pulling out for the guys. This doesn't account for a couple of them, because some of them from hometowns that no longer exist, but.
Why is Essex so much more, 250?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
What is it?
Newark.
Newark.
Yeah, like I said, if you look, you could probably even plot population density just around these numbers. And these numbers are obviously correlate to that pretty well. Okay, so we talked about the Royal Flying Corps. The British Royal Flying Corps, we had guys volunteering for service as early as 1915. I know of that list of 700, 10% of them or so joined the RFC. Royal Flying Corps first, Royal Air Force after 1 April 1918, Royal Naval Air Service, Brits had their own Navy Air Service, and we had New Jersey residents in that. They served in all operational roles, fighters, bombers, observers, and all the top scoring aces from New Jersey were from these units, and there's a reason for that. The Brits didn't require a downed airplane for a victory. They counted moral victories as well. If you put an airplane down out of a fight, looked like it was out of control, you didn't have to see it hit the ground. The Americans and the French and the Germans all required wreckage. The Brits didn't require that. So you had guys who were doing their job and actually doing exactly what they should be doing, which is clearing the sky, right? Gaining air superiority, but not actually crashing airplanes to do it all the time. One guy we're going to talk about very briefly actually participated in the Red Baron shootdown on 21 April 1918, a guy named Oliver Labouvier. And as I mentioned, there are direct entry volunteers, which are the guys who joined the RFC or the RAF or the French Air Service. And there was the other flavor of U.S. Air Service officers who were attached duty to these units. Before the U.S. got overseas and started fielding squadrons, we had plenty of trained pilots. And our guys wanted to get into it, and the Allies needed us to, so they started parceling them out to French and British units with the understanding that when the U.S. got there, they'd start withdrawing these guys with combat experience to be flight leaders and squadron commanders and that sort of thing. So this was actually very good for us and our guys to go with squadrons that had some experience. Archibald Livingston Allen is probably the first, he's the earliest one that I found in my research who joined the Royal Flying Corps. And I'm just ecstatic to say, I'll go back. So you can tell why I'm ecstatic. I'm ecstatic to own his original FAI certificate. He got over in 1915, was trained as a pilot, got a certificate in 1916, served a little bit of time as an instructor, and then was relieved from the Royal Flying Corps. We don't know why. That's not in his record. I don't know whether it was a voluntary thing, whether it was a health thing, whether it was some major's daughter thing. I don't know what it was, but he ended up out of the Corps, came back to the States, was a civilian pilot instructor here in New Jersey through the duration of the war. There were civilian pilot instructors training military guys in World War I, and he was one. Ken Unger, anybody know Ken Unger's name? Johnson & Johnson Aviation, he was one of the first pilots. Ken Unger is 18-year-old when he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1918 from Madison, New Jersey. Discovered he wasn't going to get overseas anytime soon and went AWOL. Got up to Canada, said I was born in Toronto. They said, okay, come on, let's go, we'll make you a pilot. So they made him a pilot. He got trained in Canada, where he learned to land airplanes both right side and upside down. And was an instructor there for a short time, and then got sent overseas with the Royal Flying Corps, flying Sopwith Camels.
I saw Eddie Rickenbacker, was he in that?
Now this is a bunch of British guys. Yeah, so you see the kind of droopy wing RFC. We're not going to talk about Rickenbacker. He's not even from New Jersey.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's Unger when he's on duty in northern Belgium with the RAF. Flies Sopwith Camels. They gave him U as his call number on the airplane, Ken Unger, and he turned out to be a hell of a pilot. He shot down a German ace earlier in his tour, I think in July, and then by October, when he had 12 victories, he got in a fight with this guy, 44 victory ace Josef Jacobs, flying this black Fokker triplane. It's hard to see here, but there's like a devil's head painted on the side of his airplane. It's really striking. Anyway, Unger got the best of him, turned him over, forced him down, shot the airplane out, got him with a dead engine. Jacobs crashed the airplane but didn't get injured. Was back in another airplane the next day, but Unger got credit for shooting him down. So this 44 victory ace that had 3 years of experience was knocked down by a 19-year-old kid from New Jersey. And there's a beautiful shot. This is out of Unger's album of him flying that Sopwith Camel. This is from another Camel while they're actually out on patrol. So 14 victories, 2 German aces downed, one I talked about earlier, who happened to be a squadron mate of Jakob's. And he was only 19 years old when all that happened. James Pearson. Now, somebody mentioned, I have to make a correction because that's what we do, right? It's what historians do. Arthur Raymond Brooks was not the last living American fighter ace from World War I. He was the last living American fighter ace who wore an American uniform in World War I with an American unit. This guy, James Pearson, died in 1994. He had 12 victories. He was from Nutley, obviously serving with the Brits, and he was actually the last documented U.S. citizen who was an ace in World War I. I met his son. His son looks just like him, and he's about that tall, and he looks like somebody you do not want to mess with, which I imagine Jim was the same way. Another guy that joined in Canada went over, flew Sopwith Dolphins, which is an oddball airplane. The old Rhinebeck Aerodrome has one of these. It should be flying in the next year or so. 23 Squadron RAF, 12 confirmed victories. The U on the side is just a coincidence with Unger. They gave Pearson a U for his call letter.
What kind of engine was on that kind of plane?
That was a 220 horsepower Hispano-Suiza, the same that would have been in the SPAD. And it's a first, just as a kind of a World War I aviation geek kind of thing. Sopwith designed a whole bunch of airplanes. They were all rotary engine airplanes, except for this one. This turned out to be a really great high altitude fighter. It had long wings, thin aspect, high aspect ratio wings. It was a very good high altitude airplane. Anyway, so our next guy, I'm going to run through a couple biographies very quickly here. Gus Kissel from Morristown. A lot of these guys are going to be local to Morris County here. American officer this time, not a direct entry guy, so he's an American officer attached to the British. Was trained in England, and then ultimately sent to France to fly Sopwith Camels with 43 Squadron. On the 12th of April 1918, 2.5 weeks after he got to the front, he was tail end Charlie in his formation. He was obviously shot down by a German fighter pilot. His squadron mates did not know, this was on the German side of the line, they did not know what happened to him. So he wasn't reported as having been killed until much later. Because he fell on the German side of the lines, it was not certain if he had perished in the combat. No final word of his fate was given to his family. And finally, in September, 5 months after he went missing, memorial service was held in St. Peter's Church in Morristown. If you're from Morristown, you know where that is. His body was recovered by the British after they retook the ground, and he's buried in the Pont de Hennes Cemetery in Belgium. He's the only American in the cemetery, in France, excuse me. He's the only American in that cemetery. And every year, the mayor of that town puts an American flag and a French flag on his grave. And if you've ever been to the American cemeteries in France, you know what respect the French have for what our guys did in both World Wars. I mean, we talk about the French being snooty and all. That's Paris. It's like going to New York City and saying that's what Americans are like. Right? But if you go to Iowa or any place out in the heartland, you find a lot of different attitudes. So that's what I just said. He's the only American in that cemetery. So that was sort of the fighter command guys. There were also guys who served in the bombing mission. I have 2 paintings over here on the side. One of them is a painting. It's actually a print of this painting. It's not the original painting. World War II, everybody knows about the missions into the Ruhr Valley and the Rhine Valley. Our guys are going over there with bombers. That wasn't a new concept. They were doing this in World War I. So the Brits started it in 1918 with these DH-9 airplanes, which are super unreliable engines. They would have a third of the flight drop out before they even got to the target. Engine troubles on these airplanes, all kinds of crazy planes. A good airframe, but a lousy engine. And these guys were being forced to fly these missions deep into German territory. And the Brits, typical with their stick-to-it attitude, just kept flying them. And some of these units were so heavily damaged in these missions that they had to shut these squadrons down a couple of times. So they were losing a lot of airplanes. real quick, one mission from an American guy here, Jimmy Valentine from Glen Ridge. Jimmy was another volunteer. He went to Stevens Institute of Technology. Went to Canada, enlisted, went into RFC, was selected for bomber training, was trained further in England, and then sent to sent to England, where they formed up 104 Squadron, which was one of those strategic bomber units. That's him right here. There's two Americans in the photograph. There's another one right there, Frank Beaufort from Alabama. But this guy's from Jimmy Valentine's from New Jersey. So Jimmy goes out, he gets in this squadron, and he's in there in July. I think he's flying missions July and August, June, July, and August. He's on a mission in August, 22nd of August 1918. You run into German home defense fighters who have been moved to that area specifically to interdict these bombers. As the Germans started to figure out what we were doing, it was no longer tactical stuff along the front lines. These guys were going 150 miles to bomb railroad sidings and production facilities and all that. They started deploying more fighters there. 8 of 12 of those DH-9s on that mission were shot down. Some of the crews were POW'd, some of them were KIA, obviously. But Valentine was one of those guys. He was shot down and captured. And this letter home to his parents on the 25th of August is kind of an understatement. It says, "I'm slightly wounded and a prisoner, but I'm having the best of care, and I'm getting one finally, so there's no cause for worry at all." And this was typical. The letters I read from these guys, it doesn't matter how bad they're wounded, they always say the same thing. "Don't worry about it, it's okay, I'll write when I get a chance." He was actually wounded pretty badly in the left foot. Foot was eventually amputated in Germany. Repatriated after the war, and came back home, obviously. Jay Collins, another New Jersey boy from New Brunswick, our only New Brunswick aviator, by the way. Flew RE-8s, another Royal Flying Corps direct entry guy, not an American officer, but with the Brits. Flew the RE-8, which is an observation airplane, an ugly, slow, aerodynamically deficient airplane. He was with the unit 4 days, was taken off for a mission, stall, spin, crash, and unfortunately, Jay ended up in the parent cemetery in Belgium. I met the family a few years ago, and they let me take photographs of some of his things, including his identity bracelet that he was wearing at the time. There were more than this with the British, so we won't kind of hammer the British too much, but these guys are all Montclair, all around the state. Some of them were fighter pilots, some of them were bomber pilots, some of them were unfortunately lost in action, some of them made it home. But you need to understand that these guys were serving with the Brits directly. This uniform up here, I brought 4 uniforms today, and believe it or not, all 4 of these were worn by guys from New Jersey. I've been collecting, besides collecting this stuff, I've run into a lot of great people, and once they find out what my interest is, when something like this pops up, the first guy they call is me, which is great. So this uniform is from one of the direct entry British volunteers, a guy named John Lyell. He was an instructor pilot in England. His tunic is right here. Make sure you take a look at those before you go to, if you haven't already had a look at them. Fortunately, the uniform came with his logbook, so I got a good ID. The only thing I don't have is a good photograph of him. I think this is him, but there's no ID on the photograph, and this is a part of the problem with searching the British records. It's tough to get photographs of these guys who were in the training command. Everybody at the front, there's tons of photographs. Anybody in training command, not so much. We also had volunteers with the French. These guys were very early. Everybody knows the Lafayette Escadrille, right? 38 Americans who served as fighter pilots with the French in 1915 and 1916. While the French were taking pilots into other branches of the other squadrons in the air service, we had about 20 New Jersey natives in there. They served in fighter observation and bombing units. Most were direct enlistment, which meant they served as French officers or French enlisted guys in French units. And then we later had some United States Air Service guys who were on attached duty to those French units, again with the idea that when the U.S. started bringing squadrons online, they would be pulled back and serve in U.S. units. And it was a very effective way, again, to train our guys on active duty without putting them in experienced units and then bringing them back to lead inexperienced units. And so we had a few guys with the French Air Service. John Adams, this is just a couple of photographs. Charles Morley Jones, Stephen Tyson from Princeton, Schuyler Lee from Bloomfield. I mentioned the Lafayette Escadrille. This is Ronald Hosquier from South Orange. His family was very prominent. His father was a super wealthy investment banker in New York. When Ronald was a student at Harvard University, in his junior year, I think it was his junior year, he left school to go to France to volunteer. He volunteered for the ambulance service first, and then he went into the air service. That was sort of the path for a lot of these guys. When his parents discovered what he was doing, they shut down their home, quit his job. They both went to France and served in the Red Cross in the same area that Ronald was in. The Lafayette Escadrille used this Indian head, this Sioux Indian head insignia. This is actually a squadron pin from the U.S. version of the Lafayette. When it was absorbed into the U.S. Air Service, it
Did he
became...
survive?
So, it's funny you should mention it, because that's the next slide. So this is the insignia that they were using on airplanes in April of 23rd of April, 1917.
Notice the insignia is the reverse of the Nazi
Yeah.
swastika.
Yeah, it's you guys all probably know that this is an ancient good luck symbol in a lot of different cultures. The Nazis are the ones that made it evil. But before that, it was just a good luck symbol. Hosquier was a fighter pilot, but the Lafayette had one two-seater, and he thought he could do more damage with an airplane that had two seats. He had a gunner in the back and a pilot in the front. So he went up by himself with his gunner, one airplane flight. He got jumped by a couple of German airplanes, and unfortunately he shot the wings off his airplane in April of 1917. It's a photograph of his funeral. You see that coffin is draped in the American flag. That's Hosquier. And this one was his French gunner, a guy named John Dressy. Just outside of Paris, in a town called Saint Cloud, is the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial. Does anybody know about that? You've heard, yeah, some people have heard of it. Even doing this all my whole life, I didn't hear about it until about 25 years ago or so. It's been there since 1928.
Didn't they just renovate it?
They did, yeah, absolutely. And the American Battle Monuments Commission took it over. It's been under French,
Right.
well, just for a long time. We took it over and renovated the whole thing. But in that memorial, it's a huge edifice, beautifully done. There are sarcophagi in the crypt underneath that hold the remains of these guys from the Lafayette. There were a couple guys from New Jersey who were in the Lafayette Escadrille. Well, one from the Lafayette Escadrille, a couple other guys who served with the French Lafayette, what's called the Lafayette Flying Corps. But those guys are in that crypt. So Raoul Lufberry, whose name might be familiar to another famous World War I pilot, he's in there. Hosquier's in there. Stephen Mitchell Tyson, who we saw just a little bit ago, is in there. If you ever get a chance to go to Paris, if you have any aviation interest at all, which everybody here does, you have to go to this. You have to go here and see this.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I always heard it was escadrille.
Yeah, because we're American, you know. So it's escadrille. Yeah, the French would politely correct you. Escadrille, monsieur, escadrille. So Lafayette Escadrille. It just means squadron. Valentine Berger from Leonia. Here's a little bit of a interesting thing. He's got one wing on his wing here, his wing badge. It's an observer gunner. He was an infantry officer who was trained by the French as an aerial gunner. Okay, so we had infantry officers, besides pilots, you had infantry officers, artillery officers who were assigned to French units. Berger was one of them. He served with a unit called C-46, which was a protection squadron. These were gunships that were assigned to French bombing units, and all they did was patrol outside, position themselves outside of these squadron formations to fight off the German fighters that were coming around. So on 11th of August, 1918, Berger is out on a mission, and he's out there doing his job, protecting these bombers, and he says, this is out of his unpublished memoir, he says, things were hot for us for a while. My machine gunner and I were shooting for our dear lives, and the bombers were doing their work and sticking together like a bunch of leeches. Suddenly, my pilot called attention to about 6 Huns, the Germans, in formation diving on the bombers. At the same time, he put our machine into a dive straight into the Huns, and I let go at them with my Lewis gun, holding my finger on the trigger. That's his forward-mounted machine gun. And the result of that was the other painting on the side, which you'll see here. This is Berger's airplane, flew number 13, shot the wings off with this Fokker D-7. Later turned out to be 20 Victory Ace Hans Pippart, the squadron commander of Jagdstaffel 19. Berger, as a front gunner, had 4 confirmed victories, which is pretty unusual for a gunner. And when the U.S. squadron started to come online, and the U.S. Air Service says, Mr. Berger, you're now coming over to the United States Air Service, he says, I don't want to leave. You guys have no idea what you're doing yet. I've been with this French squadron, you know, I know my pilot, I know my guys, we've all been experienced. He did not want to come back to the U.S. Air Service. He came back to the U.S. Air Service because that's what he was ordered to do, and he was shot down while he was with the U.S. Air Service. Not killed, but he was shot down. His pilot was pretty badly wounded in the event. He was one of those guys who loved working with the French and did not want to come back to the U.S. Air Service until those guys had a little more operational experience. Okay, so finally we get to the U.S. Air Service. There are 2 uniforms up here, actually 3 uniforms up here. This uniform was worn by a guy named Richard Smith Austin from Bound Brook. He was an observer gunner with the 166th Air Squadron. This uniform is from a guy named Harry Tucker from Boonton, New Jersey, and he was a pilot instructor at Issoudun, France. And the last one, which is really, really rare, is a balloon observer, another guy from New Jersey, balloon observer who served, I think he was with the 7th Balloon Corps. But this kind of represents a gathering of all of the services. The only thing I'm missing is a French Air Service uniform that was worn by a New Jersey guy, which is going to be super. I might not live long enough there to get that. But the idea here is to kind of represent everybody. So the U.S. Air Services, I talked about just a little bit. Pilots and gunners, these were late starters because we didn't get to the war. We didn't declare war until April of 1917. And we didn't start putting operational squadron in France until April and May. No, it was April of 1918. So a year later, imagine that. So everybody knows that during war, we were not prepared to get into World War I. There was only about 38 trained pilots in April of 1917, U.S. pilots in April of 1917. We had no aircraft production facilities outside of the training, Curtiss airplanes and that stuff. It was a mess here in the States. And that did not get corrected until after World War I, by the way. So real quick, a handful of Morris County guys. Harry Tucker I talked about, Arthur I. Benton, John Osmond, you're going to see in a minute, Gus Kissel, let's talk about these guys real quick. Tucker, I mentioned his uniform, April of 1917. Ken Hooker, New Jersey, served at the 3rd AIC, which is the Aviation Instruction Camp at Issoudun. This is the largest U.S.-run training facility in France. It might have been the largest aviation training facility in the country at the time, completely built by Americans. American-run, American-built, flying French training airplanes, these Newport fighters here. They had both fighter and bomber training at this facility. And they had some crazy painted airplanes. And there's a reason for it. It's not just kind of a affectation. These guys were the combat instructors there. And you would be out, if you were on that combat line and you were just out tooling around practicing, and one of these guys drove up on you in one of these airplanes, it was an invitation. And the next 5 minutes, you were going to be mixing it up with just this guy. That was part of the combat training. And they would often just sneak up on you. Don't give you any warning. But the planes were painted like this so they were easily identifiable. Charles Hopkins was a student there at the 3rd AIC. Unfortunately, he was involved in a mid-air collision. Got from Newark. See, again, there's not much left of this airplane. Also at the 3rd AIC at the time was a Princeton University student named Denny Holden, who later on went on to be a 7 victory ace. His diary recorded this event this way. He saw the collision happen. It was a couple of miles away. He got in an airplane to fly over to see what he could do about it. And when he was flying over, he saw the 2 airplanes on the ground. He later recorded in his diary, then I saw 300 yards apart lay not wrecked machines, but just flat patches of torn linen, no shape, no volume, just blots on the ground. And for a radius of 300 yards were shreds of wreckage. I came down and landed beside the smash-up, and I didn't get out. I don't like death. I'm not curious to see it. They dropped the bodies out, meaning out of their flying suits. The flying suits held the flesh together. If they hadn't, they couldn't have collected enough to bear it. This is Holden when he was at Princeton University. They had a small little flying school there in 1917. Another New Jersey story. Anyway, Arthur Kent from Pine Brook. I hate to give you so many crash stories, but the guys who got killed were the ones that were the best documented. So Kent was from Pine Brook. He was training here in the States, had just gotten his wings, got himself in trouble in the Curtiss Jenny, and ended up losing his life in mid-1918. John Osmond, who's on the list. Osmond was the half-brother of Ken Unger. So Ken Unger, our Sopwith Camel Ace, his brother was also a pilot from Madison, New Jersey. Osmond served in the Bomber Command, flew the DH-4, the so-called flaming coffin, and they called it that because pilot, gunner, fuel tank. Okay. They're not self-sealing at the time. You get a bullet in it, it's going to be trouble. Anyway, but all the pilots I've talked to who flew the airplane, and this is what I'm talking about when I'm in my teens and early 20s, there's still enough guys around to talk to, loved the airplane. They thought it was a great airplane. The whole fuel tank thing was obviously a problem, but the airplane itself, they said, was fast, reliable. The engine was very reliable. It was faster than a lot of German fighters. So Osmond is in the 20th Aero Squadron, the 11th Aero Squadron, flying missions, flying all the way up till the end of the war. These are great in-flight shots of the DH-4 in these kind of loose formations. This is what the bombing formations might look like in 1918. On the 4th of November, he's on a mission, and it's close to his birthday, and he says, thinking the best way to celebrate was to go over the lines, celebrate his birthday that is, and present Fritz with my compliments in the form of a few bombs, which we had no special use for on this side of the lines. I started out in a formation to raid Hunlin that afternoon, and Fritz evidently thought that my plans were not sufficient celebration for such a salubrious occasion. For when we reached our objective, up came 6 or 7 of the scout machines to greet us, and made me the present of the fight of my life. The Boches were never more daring nor aggressive as far as my experience has gone than this fight. One enemy airplane closed to within 25 yards of my ship, and my observer just shot into him in time to keep him from shooting up our plane. And he went down in a wing slip, just missing the tail of my plane. Archie was also mighty numerous, meaning anti-aircraft fire, and accurate. And when I reached the drone, all the tail surfaces of my plane had to be changed on account of bullets and shrapnel holes. And this was on the 4th of November. It was the last mission flown by the squadron at the time. The weather was awful for the next week, raining almost every day. So this was the last operational mission for that squadron. And there's actual photographs from one of the other units that was with him on that day. This is from the 166th Air Squadron. But these are kind of the recon photos that were taken. Here's a bomb hit down here. There's one of the other 166 airplanes flying into the camera lens, both from that mission on November 4th. Harry Anderson from Dover, New Jersey, joined the National Guard, I think in 1915. Was trained at North Island, San Diego as a pilot, one of the very earliest of the U.S. Air Service pilots. Went over to France, was a commanding officer of the 88th Aero Squadron, and then was promoted to the command of the 5th Corps Observation Group, which had a couple of observation squadrons attached, including the 88th, his old unit. Survived the war, was part of the Army of Occupation at Trier, France. Part of the duty for the 88th and these guys was to collect the airplanes that the Germans were turning over. And of course, that meant this. This is a hangar at Romorantin, France. These are turned over German airplanes, just row after row after row after row. And if you're like me, who likes to build and fly these old things, just seeing this is like going to the candy store. I wish we had one of them. And there was hundreds of airplanes. Fokker D7 tails as far as you can see. Well, these airplanes were interesting to the Americans because they had faced them in combat. The Fokker D7 was a really great airplane. American pilots wanted to fly it. So, of course, Harry decides he's going to fly one of these airplanes that is turned over by the Germans on the 21st of February, 1919. He has an engine failure, the airplane crashes, and he's killed in the crash. And this happens fairly frequently. Guys were flying these airplanes and they had some kind of issue with them. And unfortunately, a lot of our guys got killed after the war doing this. Any hockey fans? College hockey fans? No? Nobody? Just aviation, right? The name Hobie Baker mean anything to you? No? The Hobie Baker Awards for the best amateur hockey player in the U.S., best college hockey player. He was a Princeton University student. He was the best hockey player there. He went to St. Paul's University after that. Hobie Baker was killed in a SPAD crash after the war, the day before he was supposed to ship home. But this happened quite a bit, sort of to illustrate that point. Two guys who didn't get killed, William Gray Schaffler from Lakewood and Louis Neidhart, both observation pilots. And my favorite guy in the whole bunch, Philip Cassan. Never saw a day of combat, So you might say to yourself, well, why is this guy your favorite guy? Why isn't it one of the aces? Because this is the first World War I pilot I ever talked to. When I was 17 years old, he was living in Princeton, New Jersey, and he was 83 years old at the time. I was 17. I was working on my private ticket. I called him up to ask if I could come over and interview him. And I must have sounded him like, you know, somebody who could do an interview because he invited me over. And I was just a 17-year-old pimply-faced, I have no idea what I'm doing kind of kid. And I went over and the whole interview was me going, wow, you flew Spats, wow, oh my God, you flew, oh man, that's really great. The whole interview was like that. I had it recorded. I know exactly what it sounded like. This was it. But this is before I knew much about anything about World War I aviation. It was just sort of a fascination at the time. So we talked for a couple of hours about flying in general, about what he did overseas. I had no idea what he did overseas, but I had taken a magazine with me, and the lead story in the magazine was about one of the bases he trained at. Just dumb luck. And when he opened it up and started looking at pictures, stories started coming out. I almost got killed flying over this thing. I got into a spin. They hadn't given us spin training yet. I had to figure out how to get out of a spin, you know, with only 3 hours of flying time or whatever it was. And just one story after another about how he was in bombing training for the first couple of months. Didn't want to be a bomber. When he found out he was going for bomber training, he said, I want to be a fighter pilot. I want to go to France. I want to go to France. I want to go. And he said he went around to the adjutant every day and complained that he wanted to go to France. And ultimately, a request for 30 pilots for training for France came down. And he went to the adjutant, and the adjutant said, Kassam, your name's on the head of the list. Just leave me alone from now on. So he went to France. So he's halfway through the bomber program. Got over fairly early in October, went halfway through the bomber program, then got transferred to fighters, spent nearly the rest of the war in fighter training and aerial gunnery training. Got over to the front 5 days before the war was over. So when he passed away, after my third interview with him, he didn't pass away because of the interview. That doesn't sound right. I interviewed him, and sometime later, he passed away. His wife called me and said, my husband had some things he wanted you to have. And he had kept his footlocker from the war, and it had virtually every travel order he ever had. His pilot's wings, his goggles, a propeller tip from a SPAD, his logbook, photograph of his Italian flight instructor. There's a whole story behind him. He's a crazy bugger. That's all you really need to know about him. And 115 letters he wrote home to his parents during the war. And some of them had photographs in them, and some of them had, you know, other ephemera in. And it was really great to get my hands on all that stuff and kind of fill out his experience. This is what a pilot certificate looked like, issued by the Italians in 1918. The Brits, the French, the Germans, the Americans, obviously, all had this same quote of Fédération Aéronautique Internationale certificate. Looks the same. Obviously, the text is slightly different language, but it looks, the layout is the same. This was one that was issued by Italy to Kassam in 1918. His dog tags, his Italian wings, his goggles, and this beautiful pair of Tiffany struck pilot's wings. All this other stuff came to me after he passed away. This pair of wings, when we started talking about flying and I told him I was getting ready to take my private check ride, he gave me those wings and said, wear these, they'll bring you luck. And they did, I passed, so that was good. But I wore those just last week too for another thing I'll talk about in just 2 minutes here when we get to the end of the presentation. The sort of the owner manual for the SPAD, propeller tip. Apologize for this lousy photograph, propeller tip from a SPAD. It's from the same airplane. You see that 7731? That was Kassam's airplane, serial number 7731. That propeller tip came off of it. That's a photograph of it. And as Howard mentioned, I took up painting later in life primarily to document the stories of these New Jersey guys who nobody is ever going to paint. Everybody paints Rick Doffman and Eddie Rickenbacker and some of the other guys. Nobody is painting a picture of Phil Kassam's airplane. Nobody, besides you guys in the room and me and maybe other groups I've talked to, nobody's ever heard of him. But that didn't stop me. One of the interviews, I brought him a drawing of his airplane. And he was having a hard time breathing. He had emphysema at this point. And he picked up the drawing and I have it taped, and you can hear him just go dead silent. Everything goes quiet. And under his breath, he says, "Dear old Spad." Like he was looking at a picture of a girlfriend from 60 years ago. And it was, you guys in service who've flown particular airplanes know what that means. You know, you have a particular love for an airplane. It's a different feeling. Anyway, so dear old Spad. So when I learned to paint, I did a portrait of his airplane and called it, predictably, Dear Old Spad.
So how'd you learn to paint?
Well, you guys all know Keith Ferris?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the answer. American Society of Aviation Artists. I sent Keith a couple of photographs of really crappy paintings that I did when I first started. And he was very polite and said, "You should come to our meeting. There's a lot of people just like you who love aviation and want to paint. And we have sort of an academic organization." And that was 25 years ago. And at this point, I've kind of figured it out, I think. I've been past president of that organization, so it's... I don't think you can learn to paint unless you know how to draw. I've been drawing my whole life, so the painting was a secondary thing. But again, the reason I started painting at all was just to document these stories. Because again, these guys are not going to have that. So let's go back to the aces. Somebody asked about this earlier. Here's photographs of the known aces from New Jersey. Zenos Miller from Princeton. Leslie Rummel, Newark. Oliver LeBoutelier. Jim Pearson, who we saw earlier. And Ken Unger, whose name you know. Notice that most of those guys were with the Brits. LeBoutelier was the guy who was the only American in the unit that was responsible for shooting down Richthofen in April of 1918. So, somebody mentioned that I'm associated with the Golden Age Air Museum, and that's true. I have to confess, I lived in Jersey for 54 years. I had been going out to the museum every weekend to help them work on airplanes. That's where my airplane is kept. I have a 1930 Fleet, which is an open cockpit biplane. It's only a couple of years removed from the war. Great flying airplane. And we build and restore airplanes from the Golden Age and World War I aircraft. Since it was a 2-hour drive to get out there every day, my wife, not me, my wife said, "Mike, we should move. We should be close to the museum." And after about 3 seconds of debate, I said, "Okay, that's a great idea, let's go." So we moved out to Bethel, Pennsylvania. We live literally half a mile down the street from the place now. And my weekends are spent, when I'm not giving AFA lectures, building and restoring these great old airplanes and flying my old airplane. Everything we have at the museum, we have about 17 flying airframes at the museum. Everything there has either been restored or built from scratch there, and everything flies. There are no hangar queens. So we have airplanes that have 37 horsepower engines in it that fly. We have a Fokker triplane with a rotary engine in it, original rotary engine in it. We have an original Curtiss Jenny that's been restored. It's got an original engine in it, 1917 airframe. Sopwith Pup, which we finished a couple of years ago. And we're working on this thing, which is a SPAD 13, just like Ray Brooks would have flown. It does not have an original engine in it, so there's some design changes to it, but it'll be done in the colors of Charles Biddle, who was a Pennsylvania guy, 7 Victory Ace, commanding officer of the squadron. I cannot wait to fly this because this is obviously the same kind of plane that Phil Cassan flew, and I can kind of close that loop from 16 years old to current day.
Do you get to fly these planes?
Yes, I do. Yep. You build them, you fly them. That's the way it works.
With a parachute, I hope.
No parachutes. No parachutes. No parachutes, no heaters, no self-sealing gas tanks. It's kind of the same as it was. But nobody's shooting at us, that's good.
We heard somewhere that the reason they didn't issue parachutes is so that they were afraid the pilot would jump out too soon.
That's true. That was the logic. And every pilot in the room saying, I don't get it, but the ground officers were making that decision, not the pilots, obviously. The Germans obviously didn't think that, and they had several of the top scoring aces bail out of airplanes and save their lives. So part of the problem too is the airplanes at the time, they're already tight. it's really tough to fit a parachute in one of these airplanes. So that's got something to do with it. But the primary reason was they didn't want guys bailing out in the middle of a difficult situation, which is just an
You paid me,
insane
right?
thing,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
I'll pay.
So if you want to know more about the museum, you can come out and see us, or you can grab one of these brochures that I brought along. If you come out to the museum, be sure to give me a heads up. I'll be happy to docent you around. It's a beautiful place. We have one more event this year, and then we'll start over again next year. Visit the website, find out when our events are, see when the airplanes are going to fly.
Kind of like Rhinebeck.
It's like Rhinebeck, except the guy is a little more ADD, so it's not as colorful. Everything is neat. There's no stuff laying around, and the hangars are nice, and the lighting is good, and the airplanes are clean, and we don't break a lot of stuff, but as soon as we break it, we fix it, that kind of thing. So please come out and visit us. It's a great place to see these old airplanes fly. If you like early aviation, this is a wonderful place to go.
Does the museum have performances on the weekends?
Yeah, they run, it's a small museum, it's volunteer and family run, so we have one event, one formal event every month. We're open every weekend from May to October, but we have one formal event every month. It's either a fly-in or an air show. And the last one, which is a lot of fun, is in October, it's the Great Pumpkin Fly-In. We fly around for 2 days and drop pumpkins out of airplanes, trying to get them in a 55-gallon drum. Nobody ever gets it, but it's a lot of fun to watch pumpkins smash on the ground. Paul's dropped one out of the Fokker triplane, which is really a funny sight. It's a great thing. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about just for a second here, because it's a point of pride for myself and the League of World War I Aviation Historians. I'm the current president of the organization. I'm about to give up the seat in January. But I wanted to get us through this project. The National Museum of the United States Air Force has a memorial garden. If you've been there, you've seen it. There's stone monuments all around. Those monuments are privately funded. And if you had a unit, belong to a unit, get your guys together, and fund a monument, get it vetted by the museum, you can put it up. Okay? The World War I guys, nobody had put up a monument for them. And by the time they started the garden, most of those guys were gone. So the League noticed this a couple of years ago and decided that we should spearhead this project to put up a monument for the World War I guys. So we spent the last year raising $30,000 to put up a monument for them. And last week, on Saturday, on a beautiful day with a packed house outside with the families of World War I veterans in attendance and the League members there and folks from the museum. And really great. We dedicated this memorial on the 21st. And since I designed the memorial, I got to pick the photograph that was used on the front. And this is a unit that had a New Jersey guy in it, a guy named Henry Nutt. It also happens to be a beautiful photograph, but that was it. So it lists the units, all the units that got operational before the end of the war, the different flight badges and the services, the Brits, the French, the Italians we were with, and the U.S. Air Services. That's where it sits now. It's 5 foot wide and 5 foot tall.
Very nice.
Beautiful monument. This was at the dedication ceremony. We had a B-1 flyover right at the end of the national anthem in the beginning. And I'll tell you, in full afterburner, those things are loud. And he was not but maybe 3,000 feet off the ground. He was really kicking.